Yeah, hi, my name is Imran, and we'll let the panelists introduce themselves. But my name initially, I've started, I guess, my career in technology a long time ago, 23 years ago. And, you know, it was very interesting to see the market as it was and how the market has evolved over time. I think what we're all going to be able to do is share our own experiences and where, you know, change has occurred. And increasingly why this is relevant for most people here. I mean, just for show of hands, just to help me understand, hands up if anyone has ever used in their own personal lives systems such as, you know, WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal. Yeah, lots of people. A lot of the problems aren't from you guys, because you guys know that surveillance is important and you have to be, you know, professional. It's your clients that you should be worried about, because your clients use these platforms, your clients contact you on these channels, and unless you're particularly careful, you could fall foul of some very tight regulations, which we're going to be discussing today, and looking at how people have fallen down over the past. But allow me to ask the panel to introduce themselves. So we've got Rob, we've got Rob and Anish as well. So if you can help introduce yourselves.
Good morning, Robert Mason. I'm the Director of Regulatory Intelligence at Global Relay. For those of you unaware, Global Relay are a technology firm that produce solutions for record keeping and surveillance purposes. Most of my experience, however, has been in the compliance space. So I worked as a manager in the surveillance and monitoring teams at a couple of tier 1 banks over the course of about 10 years. And possibly just worth mentioning that before that I spent 5 years with the UK's conduct regulator, the FCA, helping to supervise what banks and brokers and the regulated community should be doing around their surveillance solutions. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Anish.
Good morning, everyone. So Anish Kalraiya, Head of Surveillance for UK for Crédit Agricole. I've been with the organisation now for 6 years. I've had about 12 years probably in industry, working in the surveillance industry. Prior to that, I've done various roles, including operational risk, front office trading, most of which has sort of like enabled me to sort of like, you know, climb up the corporate ladder to where I have achieved what I have done so today. This was a much larger audience about 5 minutes ago. It's about 50% reduced now. So I'm hoping that what we have to say is still going to intrigue the remainder of you who are still in the room.
Thank you. And before we jump into the questions, I just want to give everyone a little bit of context. So we are in an interesting time. I'm just going to read some information here. So September 2022, if you were around in this space at that time, you'll be familiar that the US regulator, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, they fined a lot of firms, and, you know, collectively $1.1 billion. It might just sound like a number, you know, when you read it in the paper, but let's look at what that breaks down to. You know, that breaks down to many different firms paying, you know, $125 million fines, $50 million fines, $10 million fines, okay? Now I'm going to read the list just because when I read it, to me, if you're not on this list, you're not in the business, right? So you've got Barclays Capital, Bank of America, Citigroup, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, Goldman, Morgan Stanley, UBS, Jefferies, Nomura, Cantor Fitzgerald. If you're not in that list, are you actually banking? Right, so that's my real question. Because everyone I've just mentioned, those are the people I would go to if I was conducting a business. So this is why it's very important that you understand the fines that are being imposed, and we're going to talk about this. In the pre-discussion, we were trying to start off on a positive note. So we're going to start off on a positive note. What are the good strategies? You know, what strategies are there out there that help firms run a succinct, regulatory compliant surveillance operation? And, you know, I'll ask the panel here, Rob, if you have any ideas what makes a positive experience.
Thanks for that. I think we should start positively. And as I said, you know, I feel like I've got a big allegiance to the surveillance community broadly. And I think that, you know, the perennial challenge that all surveillance teams face is that they never get sort of any credit whatsoever for the train wrecks that they avoid. I think there's potential so many instances where early identification has prevented something really serious from coming to light. In my experience of managing tier 1 institutions, there was lots of good fun stories, but you don't know where they'd have ended up had we not identified them early. But I would say that a good trademark of properly efficient surveillance is that you don't get to hear about it, almost by definition, I guess. I'm sort of continue to be surprised a little bit by the bank's view, particularly in lieu of the massive list which Imran's just sort of run through. They're looking to cut budgets again and recognising that there is a commercial aspect to this, but cutting compliance teams in a climate where the regulators are as aggressive as they've ever been seems an interesting choice, I'd say the less, and it's not a great optic either. What I would think is that those surveillance and compliance resources are essentially insurance policies for the banks. And if invested in decent surveillance, and when I say that, that includes the data, that certainly includes the engine or the vendor in some instances, but also includes, without a shadow of a doubt, good quality people to instigate that. That adds up to the level of investment which will ultimately save you money. What I think we've seen is those banks that have invested a little bit more shrewdly are probably ones which have avoided some of those sanctions, notwithstanding this particular issue. And when you look at the errors that have been incurred, that might be a trading loss, there might be legal costs almost certainly when wrangling with a regulator to argue what the level of sanction might be. The fines themselves, obviously, and all of those costs also are dwarfed by the remediation cost of putting the problem right and the resources deployed which do that. And that is such a far higher price than paid to take some preventative medicine up front. I'll let Anish tell us how good his surveillance is.
Yeah, thanks. Well, actually, our surveillance is pretty decent.
Just to confirm, the reason you've never heard of any of us is because, we do our jobs properly. And,
Absolutely. If anyone was sort of wondering if there's any regulators in the room, we do have effective and efficient surveillance first and foremost. But in order for us to get there, what does good look like? I think good sort of takes many forms for many different organisations, many different sort of surveillance leaders and institutions. Good for me takes the following forms. To have effective surveillance, you need collaboration. It's, what are your desired needs? How do you get to the point of trying to identify what your risks are? Do you have good risk assessments? Does that sort of like highlight for you basically your good versus your high, your low, your medium risks? How does that sort of interplay then with what you're doing on your trade surveillance side, which then coincides with what you're doing on your e-com surveillance side? I know this is primarily for the audience here about e-coms, but I think both play a complete significance to one another. You don't have one without the other. I think when you go into investigative concepts, you do sort of like interplay basically both at the same time. So good for me is, it's like I said, it's the collaboration. It's how do you interact with your IT departments, your front office departments? Do you have buy-in from your front office? What's the collaboration between your first line and your second line? And I think all of this collectively incorporates into what good surveillance can look like. But how do you get to having good surveillance? Well, unfortunately for us, we are driven by our regulators and our regulatory demand, the expectations, what they want from us these days, which is ever increasing. But ultimately, all the fines which are being given out to many of the banks, which Imran has basically mentioned, come from the fact that there are bad actors. There are bad actors in many organisations, probably bad actors in your own organisations. And it's basically, how do you identify those? Well, one way is that basically we give up data through investigations to our regulators. They come back to us. They tell us, this isn't basically what you should have been doing, or this isn't what you should have been capturing. Why haven't you done better? And that sort of like, initiates, in essence, remediation programs. So we almost need those remediation programs. We need the regulators to sort of stipulate to the market exactly what people have done as wrong. And that sort of drives the rest of us to want to sort of follow through. And so you need that to follow on to what we then define, what we call then the good surveillance.
Thank you. And I think just to highlight what Anish mentioned there, I think good also looks like if you have a strong leadership team that understand, as Rob mentioned, preventative measures are important, but obviously everyone's got a budget. You can't spend hundreds of millions of dollars on something that may or may not work. So again, I think it's important to make sure your requirements are clear. Technology is out there. If you've ever wondered, what kind of RegTech solutions are out there to help you, just look outside. There are many, many teams out there. I was in the booth outside talking to a couple of them myself. They do offer these solutions. And if you're not sure what solutions are for you, Deborah has got a nice list of, on that regulatory RegTech association, the types of things you should be monitoring and looking for. If your organizations have never heard of these things and you're not doing some of these things, you really need to start asking yourself the questions, why not? I think it comes with strong leadership. And I think one of the things we'll look at now is the rapid change of technological change. So, Rob, what do you think about how technology can help organisations meet their requirements?
So I think that the pace of change is a real challenge. I think it was spoken about in the very first session of the day. We're obviously engaging with our prospects and clients, and particularly specifically around electronic surveillance of communications. We've just seen the number of channels leap up in sheer volume numbers. There's a bit of COVID to blame for that, but ultimately even the less well acquainted will recognise that Bloomberg, Refinitiv, Symphony, ICE Chat, Teams, Zoom, Slack, CME, Cisco, Skype. I've written a few down here that are not the norm that you might see, notwithstanding your emails and your usual stuff. You interlace some stuff as well, like LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X, YouTube, TikTok. Where do we end here? And immediately you see the challenge of the volume of data that's needed to be collected, captured. We've not even touched on things like attachments, IDs, metadata that might be inside those particular data sets, and is clearly a challenge for both record keeping and to do any sort of meaningful monitoring around that. I think technology does provide some capabilities, and we're a strong exponent of building those clever bits of kit which help manage and accommodate all those different data sources so that you can see them in a uniform way. You can keep the records in a clear and consistent fashion, and you can monitor the underlying data effectively. I think this is a specialised discipline, and getting that right at the absolute outset is absolutely fundamentally critical to being able to find anything interesting at the end. Strong technology and flexibility of those solutions is also important. Banks like Anish's require some flex so they can build on top of the tech that they might invest in. They'll have their own set of risks which are going to be prevailing to them specifically. So it doesn't need to be closed tech, they need to build in some other areas. But I see vendors' job here as being someone who can help banks both improve on the quality of the data themselves and also be an enabler and not a blocker for business. So if a client wants to call on a channel and do some business, then be able to accommodate that, I think, is really important. We haven't even talked about voice there. That's a whole different thing around transcription and translation, but there are some technologies that really, really are moving the needle.
And I just want to highlight there, the easy answer, I think, Rob, from what you've just asked is, let's just ban all those platforms and say that our people can't use them. Right, Anish?
I think that would be somewhat of an easy solution to just say no to everything, but then I think what that encourages is going on to unauthorised devices. So perhaps not the best idea, depending on which way you look at it. Look, without the technology, we can't do our job in compliance, as simple as that. If I told a story about where we've sort of migrated from Crédit Agricole, so I joined the organisation 6 years ago. When I joined, we had about 6 or 7 separate siloed systems. Global Relay was one of them, and still remains. And we had Discovery Accelerator, which is part of Veritas. We had Global Relay. We had Smarsh for looking at SMS mobile messages. We've got NICE. We had so many solutions. None of them were speaking to each other. None of them are automated for us. Bloomberg Vault, sorry, was another one. And so, we found the monitoring part, what we were doing on a sample-based approach, extremely difficult. The main issue really sort of came to a head when we had a regulatory store visit in 2019. The FCA came to visit us. They sort of said that you're not doing enough in your comm space. They put us into a remediation program. It was primarily focused on trade. Now they're asking us more questions on the comms. And so we had to basically take the option to migrate away from multiple systems to single source system. So we now utilize a technology provider in the e-comms, vCom space called Shield. So like you said, Rob, we give up our data from the source places that it's coming from some of our data lakes. It goes into the Shield system, and that enables us to then undertake the day-to-day monitoring. What's the advantage of the technology? Well, as opposed to before, where we were doing ad hoc sample-based monitoring on a subset of our monitored population, now I can take my entire monitored and certified population, put it into one tool, and I can cover them for both e-comms and vComms, plus the SMS on the mobile side as well. So I get the added advantage of having a technology provider that enables me to do that. Now, I know that Global Relay was also a provider that could also supply that to us. Unfortunately, they were just not successful in the proof of concept, but that's all right because Rob and I still speak, which is absolutely fine. You know, he completely appreciates and understands. I'm sure there's different parts of his, you know, his offering that one day we might be of use for.
And Rob, what's your take on, you know, banning these technologies?
Well, I think you'll find that prohibition didn't work. They were banned. I think there was a fairly clear policy that all the institutions had around business communication needed to be undertaken on an approved channel. So in effect, none of those channels that were found to be used were approved. So consequently, I think prohibition is not a risk management solution which functions properly.
That makes sense. Now, of course, it wouldn't be 2024 if we didn't use the AI acronym. So how is AI going to help us? Now, just from a personal technology perspective, I've always found, you know, AI a little bit worrying, just in the sense that, you know, how does it know what to do? How does it know how to help me if I don't know myself? So I think looking at how it can take, you know, we've heard in the other room, the solutions and, you know, bringing down 95% reduction in you know, false positives, but then all the other things that we need to worry about as well. It will transform the industry, and I felt bad for Ian in the other room. He was the only one arguing the other side of the coin. But I think whether it's today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, it's coming. And I'd just like to, you know, Anish, what's your take on, you know, where AI is going to help e-coms in particular?
So I think the industry has moved on tremendously in respect and in regard of artificial intelligence. I think most of the leading market surveillance solution providers out there right now are using some elements of artificial intelligence, AI, and that comes in many forms. Okay, so whether it's for data-driven decision-making, whether it's for, you know, some sort of context and sentiment analysis, you know, I think we can break this down as some sort of like sub-core components of AI. So whether it's machine learning, NLP, large language models, or LLMs for short. But, you know, if we look at NLP, for example, specifically, so we have things like speech recognition. So it's the ability for these surveillance solutions to detect differing languages which are basically being used, okay? And this helps not just from a local perspective, it helps from a more of a global landscape. So, you know, being able to recognize there's somebody talking in English versus French versus Italian versus German. Why does that help? Well, if you can identify the language, it then helps with any transcription capabilities. So if you can then transcribe that particular language, it means you're enhancing your ability to then basically perform some sort of lexicon-based monitoring on that transcript for that audio. It sounds very obvious, but of course, this does basically play into what we all look into, especially from a global perspective. You've got speech tagging. So it's basically looking at, if you want to call it, understanding the words which are basically used in the context of a sentence. So if you can basically work out, so by segmenting the core words within a sentence which are going to be most relevant to you from a business perspective, so in other words, from a business language perspective. So, you know, we're all IBs, we're commodity firms, we're investment houses, we're all using different terminology in a slightly different way, and then that is also being used in a different way according to the asset classes that we're basically offering out to our clients. So different traders, different salespeople, different front office people are going to speak in a slightly different language. So it's becoming really important that we understand from that speech tagging perspective, what are people saying in the right context, in the right way, and how that can be identified then using AI within these software solutions. You then got speech translation. So that's basically taking a language. So we're a French bank, so if we're looking at English and we're looking at French, we've got individuals who are talking in both. It's easier for me to basically look at something in English because I'm an English speaker. I don't speak French. So how do I know what someone's saying in French? Well, if there is some sort of artificial intelligence that can basically do the translation for me in an automated fashion, all of a sudden I can look at the entirety of that text then in English. You've then got machine learning. It's the ability to basically transpose basically images into text. So again, so instead of basically people just basically tagging, say, like a Twitter or a Facebook by basing an icon, you know that's basically, you know, a Facebook or a Twitter. So you don't want to see that if it's basically going to be sort of flagged up in your lexicons because it's basically just an icon. And look, these are just all variations and forms of where I think the improvements are coming in today. It's enhancing what we're able to cover, but I think it's also getting smarter. And with better coverage, we can then basically refine using AI, basically the false positives, which is what we already alluded to before. notwithstanding the fact that there's the Gen AI bit, but I can talk about that a little bit later.
Rob, I mean, just in terms of challenges with AI, I mean, is it all easy, plug and play, it's all going to work? What's your take on that?
So I think that Anish highlights a couple of areas where we certainly are seeing some benefits, and working for a technology investor that is clearly heavily investing in this particular area, as I think all of us are in some capacity. You touch on voice transcripts, so managing voice recording and monitoring has been a really difficult challenge over a longer period of time, and historically technologists haven't done a great job. The accuracy of both recording and then transcribing that into decent English or another language has been poor. We've taken up a view using a large language model which we host, which is offered by Whisper, and we're using their largest large language model, and there is a difference between which large language model you use. This enables us to have capability in 57 languages. The traditional levels of accuracy that I'd seen probably up until maybe only 3 months ago were sort of 70%, 80%, and often get some really anomalous results. The tests which have been undertaken both internally and externally, and there's sort of an external benchmark, and we've obviously got some natural speaker language which is but not across 57, are that all of those accurate languages are transcribed to the 95+% area, and that includes the fact that there's background noise and there's colloquialisms and slang and all of the things that we've seen that are challenging when front office colleagues are using them. So I think that testing surprised me and my technical team, and I think it materially improves expectations on what I'd seen previously, and having that accurately transcribed record enables you to do some meaningful monitoring. Changing tack, I think pushing the boundaries around more accurate identification of risks and that false positive reduction. The approach that we're taking is breaking each message down into its constituent component parts. So you might see signature attendees, disclaimers, content, addressees, etc., and only really interrogating the part of the message which is relevant. And obviously, that's often going to be the content of the message. By reducing that communications into its respective bits and using the bit that's relevant, that can make the utilisation of AI much more scalable, and the problem that we've got is a scalable one, much more affordable, and I don't think everyone's quite got their head around the price of this, and also quicker. When you're looking across hundreds of millions of messages, then you need something that's able to give you some solutions. I don't think we're at a point where we can categorically say we can identify every risk at all, so there's going to be more obstacles to overcome. But I think the full-on testing and the enthusiasm which the market has got for this is going to improve the efficiency and I think the resource requirement to tackle this challenge.
Thank you. I think you both mentioned this, and it's obvious, cross-border surveillance and the various data protection laws with dealing with different countries and entities, rules, regulations. Do we feel that this is going to stabilise? It's going to go down? Is it going to go up? Where do you feel that's going to go?
I think most of the big institutions apply a sort of a global minimum standard, and then they will adhere to what the local regulations dictate, so that there's a fairly kind of standard way of undertaking that. I think the issue of differing data privacy and worker council type issues is not a new one, and comm surveillance world has sort of suffered at the hands of that a little bit. For those less familiar, basically what this is that countries will not allow monitoring of some staff outside their geographic borders. So there's French labour law, German workers' council, and obviously Switzerland has its own Swiss secrecy regulations. It hampers, therefore, rolling out a global programme which can be consistently applicable. However, there are ways of managing this risk, and there are some techniques which I think have been developed. Not least that the monitoring that's undertaken is against a set of fairly prescribed regulations, and what firms are doing are looking at a very narrow range of risks. They're not trawling through people's personal emails to see if they're going to find something salacious to read. So I think it'd be fair to say that some oversight is feasible and possible, and I think most of the big banks have kind of travelled this path. What's going to happen in the future? I don't suppose there's going to be a massive change in the legislation. What I would just identify is that I think some of those countries are not that interested or worried about the conduct of their employees. So we've seen some issues in the UK where there's a much greater focus on what's described by the FCA as non-financial misconduct. And this is sort of the bullying, discrimination, harassment type areas. And it doesn't seem that the Central European countries be too concerned about that. Now, if I was running a large organisation, and particularly a financial institution, you're going to have some risk around insider dealing, but you're going to have some inherent controls around that. If there's a problem, you remove the person, it makes the business pages, and we're all done. If some firm is branded a racist firm or a sexist firm or a prejudiced firm, then I think that's front page news, and that's a problem. So this reputational damage issue, I think, is something which comms monitoring can look for if it's allowed to by the various legislations in those geographies.
Yes, I don't think there's no easy answer around this, actually, for the cross-border element of what we're talking about here. We're a French bank, so we have to abide by French data privacy, data secrecy laws, which means that even the surveillance that's undertaken in France is going to be different to the surveillance that we undertake in the UK, that we undertake in Asia-Pac, certain countries, and the US. So it feels like, you can have a global solution, but ultimately what I think you need to do before you sort of like start rolling out your roadmap is to understand, well, what jurisdictions are you looking to roll out your surveillance into? What are the local the laws for that jurisdiction and for that country? So working with your kind of like your change management teams, you need to work with your information security teams, data protection officers, perhaps local legal, even maybe local HR if it's necessary. And you need to have it mapped out. You need to understand, what is it that I'm allowed to do there? What is it that I'm not allowed to do there? Where am I allowed to outsource? Where am I not allowed to outsource? What can I monitor? What can I not monitor? To give you a very subtle example, we can't apply certain models and behaviours that Shield offers to us because, in France versus what we can do in the UK. So, for example, anything that relates to, for example, employee conduct. Because elements of what could be included within employee conduct, so from the models, behaviours, features, the lexicons that underlie basically those particular models and behaviours might pertain to basically confidential and private information. And if it's private and it states private within the context of that particular communication, it cannot be monitored. That therefore basically makes it more difficult. But then what happens if, for example, you have a UK person talking to a French person and that particular communication gets flagged in the UK? It starts off as private, but then sort of like follows into something that could be business communication. We pick it up, we start to monitor it. What do we do with it afterwards? We can escalate it locally, but how do we take that same communication and then send it back to France? Without breaching, in essence, basically, their data privacy laws, especially if it contains the word private. And if it says the word private, ultimately, they on their side cannot basically monitor that communication. So there are certain complications that come with that, but I think it's just basically, as long as you have a robustness in your infrastructure, you have the right escalation paths, hopefully that can basically be your workaround solution for basically where you go with that.
Fantastic, thank you. Just keep an eye on time. We're jumping into questions now, so if you've got any questions in the audience, please put your hands up. I'm going to read some from the submitted questions, so by all means think of some and send them over as well. First question was, what are the biggest short to medium challenges for companies in this area of comms surveillance? And I think in our pre-chat, gents, we talked about budgets and having an appropriate response and support from leadership to continue with surveillance to the level that it needs to. And if you heard some of the talks in the other room, there is an element of, if you're big enough and you can trial some of these services to see if they fit your use case, that is definitely something that you should do. But if you're smaller and you can't necessarily have the budget for the trial and error, what can you do in those circumstances? So any ideas on short to medium challenges?
I think what I would say, the two big finds that we've seen over the last few years, we talked about the SEC record keeping at the top of this chat, and I think that the total that's been levied now is something in the region of $3 billion across the board in terms of all firms being fined for using non-approved business communications, which really is a data completeness challenge. And more recently, we've seen a big fine around venue completeness. So this is around trade surveillance predominantly, where a firm has been fined for having incomplete trade data. And I think the theme that drives those together is the completeness and accuracy of all data. Now, I think that's been something which has been on the stocks previously and has been discussed at many of these forums. But I think it's something which we haven't really all invested in as much as we might. And this isn't just about the sort of the data bytes and the technologies underneath. It's a consistent and uniform way of governing that data to make sure it comes in. Is there reconciliation opportunities to make sure it's complete? The regulators are extremely concerned about this by virtue of the size of the fines that have been levied. I think just lastly on that, as a vendor, I think we can help on the comms space, and we can certainly cleanse and improve data that our clients provide us with. We can also run some reporting stuff where things change dramatically. So if a data feed drops out, so someone's used to sending X amount of messages a day and that then reduces, I think there's some areas of focus there that we can flag. But in my view, I think this is going to be the short-term area that regulators will focus on, and so our surveillance teams will need to respond to.
And Anish, just looking at some of the other questions, how they interlay, how can companies best stay ahead of the curve, from this perspective?
Good question. Just follow what the regulator says. It's the first thing I'd say. Look, I think Rob just sort of perfectly summarised everything there. You've got AI, you've got data incompleteness, you've got unauthorised channels. Those are the three concepts for me that I think we need to be focused on in the here and now. And if you're not, they're basically three topics and concepts that you really need to be focusing your attention on for your own respective firms. AI, because of the governance around models, LLMs, basically how you're making improvements, data incompleteness, we've just spoken about the fines levied to JP Morgan, 350 million. FCA published a market watch 79 only at the back end of last week, Thursday, Friday, which alludes to exactly the same content. It basically says data incompleteness, people are basically finding things out far too late. Then when the regulators are basically asking questions around what you're doing in your surveillance program, they're highlighting the fact that basically your data is missing for X period of time, and they're definitely showing their dissatisfaction in this area. So, it's not even a watch this space, it's happening right now. The fines are coming. So if you are asked and you don't know basically what should be being included as part of your data incompleteness, it's definitely a focal area.
Fantastic, thank you. Any questions from the audience? Put your hands up if you do. I just want to touch on something that Rob was talking about. I raised this last year and I got the same response just 5-10 minutes before the talk. Conduct, culture, important, sure. It seems that nobody wants to pay for it. So, if you could pick up stress levels, if you can pick up toxic behaviors, if you can pick up bullying, if you can pick up, people who are, working a lot more than they should, can these language models pick these up and inform you? I think the answer is yes, but I don't think firms either want to pay for those or don't know how to respond or act accordingly. Does anyone on the panel have any opinions on that?
So I alluded to this non-financial misconduct sort of drive that the UK's FCA are committing to, and that was committing to a parliamentary committee. I think in response to some fairly significant scandals over the course of the last year or so, we saw a big asset manager who behaved deplorably towards his female employees. We've seen a number of occasions which have caused sort of concern, and folks very senior losing their jobs, from CEO of BP, Deputy Prime Minister, there was a television executive, let's not go television celebrity. So I think what they've required to do is commit to do something, and the FCA have sent out, I understand, at least a couple of hundred letters to the wholesale financial services industry, including insurers, to find out what people are doing around non-financial misconduct. So that's identification, how many instances, whether they were upheld, how they were identified. It might be a whistleblower, might be a complaint, it might be through surveillance. And what happened, so was there a disciplinary consequence, etc. And I think some firms might find that quite difficult to respond to. Clearly, there is a huge reputational risk to firms not having oversight of this area. And I think that there's going to be a response, well, there would undoubtedly be a response for that from the FCA, and whilst it's not a requirement as things stand, if the FCA sends you a letter that you're obliged to respond to, then you're probably going to take some action that's going to be ongoing from that point. So there's an element of it becoming a pseudo-regulatory requirement.
Yeah, I think I'd just sort of echo that. In the letters that went out, you know, we were one of them. We received it. We aggregated some data. We worked with our HR and legal departments. We provided back to the FCA. You know, I wonder whether this sort of relays back to the FCA's conduct rules and principles. You know, one being integrity. You know, having integrity within, you know, market conduct. You know, are we hiring people who are fit and proper? You know, this all sort of correlates and sort of integrates back in again. It's the people that you're hiring, are they suitable enough to basically, you know, be operating in the roles that they perform in the right manner, in the right way, and abiding by basically, you know, not just your own bank's policies, but the local laws and regulations as well. And if they're not, what are firms doing about it? And if they know that they're basically, you know, having to find certain misdemeanors around these individuals, are they taking the appropriate action? And if they're not, why aren't they? And I guess that's what they're trying to find. So they've got market abuse, they've got market surveillance, they've got looking for insider dealing, and so on and so on. We're all looking at comms, we're all sort of looking for forms of non-financial misconduct. And this all sort of relays into the same thing. It's, do we have the right people working for our organisations, you know, with the right standards and the right ethics?